seems that almost any amount of spiritual good overrides almost any amount of physical good, which is a very strange argument in the context of, right, to prove limitations on my capacity to damage my body. Okay, so
I mean, you could even use this as a argument for certain end-of-life procedures, like, I'm just going to repent on death's bed, and therefore I'm just going to withhold everything.
or you could use it as an
For
argument.
purposes of repentance,
Okay, you could
Maybe
do
my
it.
living will.
Right, if somebody said that, right, because I want to repent that way, it'd be very hard. But somebody just wanted to make an argument. You know what? That my fundamental issue is palliation.
Right.
Right, because nothing in this gives nothing here generates an obligation to preserve life.
This actually is all about palliation.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah, the more it makes you feel better, go for it.
right.
And Muchara Filu Shalom Tshuva. So, right, that's a very broad.
Yeah, Shalom Derech Tshuva, he still has to have a spiritual purpose, but maybe the spiritual purpose is because it's forbidden to die without having tasted all the pleasures of this world, which is also a Talmudic statement. So I'm gonna go, right, do my bucket list. Right, that's there we have it, the halachic word for bucket lists. So yeah, I think that actually, if you look at the sources Rosevin cites, his first one is unfortunate for his argument when you look it up. Now, as a narrative, basically, I was first aroused to this principle by reading the words. Okay, that's an autobiographical statement. I have no way of arguing, but I don't think that it's actually grounded in that at all. Okay, so now he's going to go one step further. He says, in truth, the essential halachic point of the Baal HaTanya, that the prohibition against hitting a fellow applies even when the fellow gives him permission to do so, is not made clear either in the Talmud or the Decisors. So that's a really astonishing claim. Right? So he built everything on this Baal HaTanya, and now he admits that even this Baal HaTanya, in his reading, is not grounded in precedent. Because the statement in the Mishnah that one who says, blind my eye, with the condition he will not be liable for damages, the damager is liable, right? So if I say you can poke out my eye and I won't make you pay, so you still have to pay, but that's not relevant to this issue because there the question is about compensation and not about whether the action is forbidden. So we can say that I cannot remove the obligation of compensation for you, but maybe I can say, you know what, you'll have to pay me, but you can do it anyway, and we can justify that however we want. Right? On the contrary, if any evidence can be brought from there, is it not clear in the Talmud of the Decisors that the reason for liability is that the forgiveness of compensation is not wholehearted? Okay, so let me frame that, and then we'll go look at the Talmud itself. The Talmud says that if I agree to have my eye poked out, and you go ahead and say, can I poke out your eye? Yes, I give informed consent. And then I want to, and then afterwards I want to say, well, you gave me permission, and I'm suing you anyway for my eye. So he says, if you look at the Talmud says that the real reason is that there is no possibility of informed consent. You don't really mean it. And the proof of that is that the Talmud offers other examples, not about poking out eyes, where in fact it does work. Right? Where if somebody just says, "Excuse me, can I pinch you?" and you say, "Sure, you can pinch me," and they pinch me, I can't sue them. So in fact, Zevin ends up himself saying that there is in fact, there is in fact no relationship between compensation and prohibition. It's possible to construct a case in which I have to pay compensation, but I have violated and forgiveness does no good, but I haven't violated any prohibition. And it's possible to construct a case in which I have no obligation of compensation, but I have violated prohibition. And the whole conversation in the Talmud is about compensation and doesn't relate to prohibition at all. And so in the end, he says that he has, he has a rhetorical moment in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which he himself concedes does not have halachic basis. And that's the fundamental argument for Judaism believing that you don't own your body. Okay, now we can try and build things back up and see. So let's take a look. Right, so now we have right, so now what I want to do is I want to go through the rather complicated, and we're not going to finish today, the rather complicated Talmudic passage, which really is the central question, the central legal conversation about the extent to which you can weigh other goods against physical harm. Okay, now we're going to remove this, right? This is valuable. We're going to remove this from conversation about end of life because this is not talking about death, and it might be that death changes the conversation completely, in one way or the other. So, right. So I think that Rosevin is correct that this is the primary source for addressing that issue, right? And for beginning to address the question of the extent to which you have authority, which is framed nearly, you have authority means, one meaning of authority is that you can waive someone else's duties towards your body. Right, that's one definition of authority, right? This is the inverse of the Shylock case. Rosevin said no Jew would believe that Shylock could sign a contract allowing you to take a pound of flesh. Let's find out. Okay. So now we're going to turn to source C actually no, before we turn to source C, let's take a look at the footnotes first on the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which is above that. So remember, the Shulchan Aruch Harav is not, at least the footnotes are not entirely by it. So probably what is his footnote, says that he drew everything from this Talmudic passage, from the Tosfot there, and from the Yam Shel Shlomo there. The Yam Shel Shlomo is the 16th century commentary of Shlomo Luria. Right, that's probably what the Baal HaTanya quoted as his sources. Although again, you cannot rely on the footnotes being 100% accurate. I have a bias. There's one case where I think that the editors got the footnote exactly backwards, and they footnoted the wrong. They took quoted out of sources and they footnoted it for the opposite position of what it's really supposed to be, and then they put a blank footnote for the position it was supposed to belong to because they didn't realize he had read the sources differently than everyone else had. So I don't trust the footnotes. Okay, but then there's the parentheses, which I assume is the editors, where they say, hang on a sec, where did he get this from? Because the Baal HaTanya says that you can't humiliate yourself, as far as the type of it. You can't humiliate him for the sake of money, because we have a story in which Rav says to Rav Kahana, don't stand on your pride when you need money. Right? Go skin animals in the marketplace and don't say, I'm a great man, I can't skin. So that suggests that he was humiliated by skinning animals in the marketplace, but he was allowed to do it anyway for the sake of money. So he thinks that proof is not so good. We could undo the disproof of the proof by saying that what he's really telling him is don't be humiliated by skinning, right, if you need money, as opposed to humiliate yourself if you need money. But it's an interesting question where it comes up to me always is whether we allow people to participate in reality television. Which I tend to think is self-humiliation for the sake of money. Right? So do we allow you to humiliate yourself for the sake of money or not? So the Baal HaTanya, he says no, perhaps. And then he says, what about pain? So Yaakov says to Lavan, I was out in the cold and the heat, and I was eaten by cold, right? And now why was Yaakov allowed to take a job that would cause him pain? Obviously, you are allowed to endure pain for the sake of money. Right? So the footnotes point out that as an absolute statement, these positions of the Baal HaTanya are not defensible. But we can, each of those, he's introducing narratives, each of those narratives are distinguishable on various grounds. Okay, let's take a look at what the Talmud itself says. Because the Talmud's opening statement is that the Mishnah says that the rule regarding torts is that the amount of compensation is already, this is, in the Hebrew, this is the fifth line down, I'm sorry. Right, Zaklal, Hakol Lefi Chvodo. Okay, so we have a subjective framework of compensation for damage. Okay, Rabbi Akiva comes along and says, and it fundamentally denies this, and he says even if people are right, even the poorest people in Israel, we look at them as if they are free men, which here seems to be meaning people of independent means, and they've come down the marketplace. What they are is the genteel poor. Okay, we never look at people as being part of the lower class. What they are, they're Jane Austen characters, right? Who have lost their thing, but they're still. And I think actually, to have a much broader conversation, I think generally this is a really cool notion that I think there's a lot you can learn about the rabbinic framework of ethics by reading Jane Austen. Okay, so Rabbi Akiva denies at least the absolute subjectivity. He's not willing. He's afraid that there's going to be a circumstance where we'll say, "Oh, those people have no dignity anyway. So what could I pay them?" Right? Right? He's wallowing in the muck anyway, and doing right, and allowing people to throw pies at him, right, to make money. So what could I possibly do? Okay, this is followed by a story. Okay, the story is that there's somebody who uncovers the head of a woman in the marketplace, which is seen as public shaming. Okay, how this happens we don't know. She comes before Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva requires him to pay. We missed the earlier section. Requires him to pay the highest level, right? The standard set for women who are embarrassed that way in public. You have to pay 400 zuz.
It's a large sum of money.
It's a large sum of money. It's an enormous sum of money. Right? 200 goats, according to Chagade. Right? One goat costs 2 zuz. Right? Right, so you're trying to pay 200, right, twice a ketubah. Another way around. Okay, but he says to Rabbi Akiva, "Give me time. I can't. There's enormous sum of money. I can't pay the time." He gives him time. So what he does is he waits. Right, he waits outside, and he sees the woman coming out into the courtyard, and he breaks a little jar of olive oil in front of her, and she takes the kerchief off her head and soaks up the olive oil. And he has witnesses there. And he comes to Rabbi Akiva and says, "This, I'm supposed to pay 400 zuz? It's clear what it's worth to her, right? It's worth a kerchief full of olive oil." Okay, so here Rabbi Akiva says, right, you have said nothing of consequence, right? Lo amarta klum. Hachovel ba'atzmo, somebody wounds himself. Afal pi she'eino rashai patur, even though you're not permitted to do so, you are exempt. Exempt from what remains to be seen, right? How do we punish you for having done it to yourself? Right? Obviously, it can't be financial compensation. It's kind of hard. You have to pay yourself. I mean, we could set up an obligation to go eat lots and lots of chocolate if you damage yourself. But hard to know what it means. Acharim shechavlu bo chayavim, but other people who wound him are nonetheless considered to be liable. And then, just in case you start to think that human beings are anything unique, the same is true about trees. You're not allowed to cut down your own trees. If you cut down your own trees, you're not liable. But other people cut down the same trees that you were willing to cut down, they are liable. Okay, so again, the relation to human beings is not, of the human body is not different than anything else. But at least we have what seems to be an unambiguous statement. Hachovel ba'atzmo, afal pish eino rashai. Okay, somebody who wounds themselves, even though they're not rashai. Rashai is a derivative of rashut, right? So that seems to say that this is the halachic source for the Baal Tainis claim, that a person does not have reshut over their body to harm it. Or you're not rashai. Okay, the only problem is, turn the page, we will see that the first thing the Talmud says is, you know what? We have a different story of the version. The different story of the version says, you have dived into mighty waters and come up with nothing but a potsherd, because Adam rashai lachvol ba'atzmo. Right. So in one version, Rabbi Akiva says, "You're right." Which says she wasn't allowed to do it, and therefore you have to pay. And the other version, Rabbi Akiva says, "She's allowed to do it. What does it have to do with you?" Neither of these really support the notion that there's no authority. And certainly the second one is problematic. So Rava comes along, and Rava says that the distinction is chavala, which is wounding, as opposed to shaming. And the Talmud says, hey, that doesn't work at all because the Mishnah is talking about shaming. And in fact, the Mishnah, it's the same case twice. Right? The opposite version of the same case. So making that kind of distinction is going to fail. So the solution is that a person is allowed to shame themselves. They're not allowed to wound themselves, but even though they are not allowed to wound themselves, when other people wound you, they are liable. So this is a complicated argument to try and make out. Why should we think that because you're not allowed to wound yourself, therefore someone else is liable? The other way around. You're allowed to wound yourself, right? But you're not allowed to wound yourself, and nonetheless, other people, if you give permission, other people are liable. That's a strange notion. Okay. The Talmud goes on and says, really? You're claiming that people aren't allowed to wound themselves? But we have a Breita, okay, and the Breita says that if I take an oath, and the oath that I take, I take an oath that I will cause harm to myself. So, and that oath is binding. So, if it's actually illegal to cause harm to myself, how could it be binding to take an oath to harm myself? So the answer is that I can take an oath to fast. And now we're starting to get the whole framework. Right. So I do have authority to take an oath. The Talmud ends up saying that that doesn't work so well because you're also allowed to, it's also binding if you take an oath to harm somebody else, and it says, it must be that you just tighten their belt so tight that they can't possibly eat anything, so you enforce the fast on them. But it ends up saying that, you know what, actually there is a Talmudic dispute. One person says you're not allowed to harm yourself, and one person says you're allowed to harm yourself. But then the Talmud says, really? All we found so far are people who say you're allowed to. The only source for saying you're not allowed to is the report of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah. And the report of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah we have decided was probably right, is questionable. So you've said there's a dispute about whether you can harm yourself. Maybe really everyone agrees everyone agrees that you're not allowed to harm, that you're allowed to harm yourself. So they introduce a prohibition against suicide, but they say suicide is different. Maybe you can't kill yourself. That has nothing to do with anything else. So then they say, what about the prohibition against damaging clothing? And the answer is, well, you can't damage clothing because clothing doesn't heal itself. The bodies heal yourself. There's no prohibition against harming your body as long as it will heal. And so in the end, the only thing they can do, at the end, what they can say is, the only source we have is this source about the Nazir having to bring a sacrifice for not drinking wine. So if you read the Talmudic passage straightforwardly, the first case version, first of all, there's the Tannaitic dispute. The dominant position is that you are allowed to harm yourself. It's difficult even to find a position which actually holds you not allowed to harm yourself, and when you find that position, the harm is not drinking alcohol when you want to. Okay, so that seems to me like a reasonable, take questions, that seems like a reasonable endpoint to take for the first class. And now people can go ask you, does Judaism say you don't own your body? The answer is, well, yes, if you think that you're on obligation to eat dessert and drink all the wine you want. But if you want to claim a specific duty that says Judaism doesn't own your body, and therefore, that generates an obligation to preserve life, so we just said that suicide is a completely different universe. And if you want to talk about bodily harm, it sounds like harm and pain need to be distinguished, and the prohibition is actually about pain, pain perhaps rather than harm. Even if it's harm, we distinguish between harm that heals and harm that doesn't heal. And the argument that you have limitations of the power of your body does it not by making your body unique, but by assimilating your body. Right? Whenever we talk about limitations in your power of your body, we always immediately assimilate it to something else. Rabbi Akiva's Mishnah, which says you're not allowed to wound yourself, immediately says, and you're not allowed to cut down your trees. Right? The attempt to construct the position later in the Talmud, assuming we reject the Mishnah, goes through clothing. And so really, there are no primary sources. that suggests that the prohibition against suicide per se is directly connected to a claim about bodily ownership, and there are no primary sources that suggest a unique relationship to the body, such that relates to ownership. That's the strongest way of making the claim. What we will perhaps next week, I want to finish these sources, then we'll perhaps point out that there the rest of next week, if we get that far, that there are no primary sources the other way either.
2 weeks.
2 weeks, sorry.
November
Got it, 2 weeks, right? So that at the end of the day, it may be that not only is it not a great question, it's a question that has never been addressed really in Jewish sources at all. So we're making it up, which is what we started in the first place.